Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third session of the Indian Economics webinar series that is hosted by Ashoka Economic Society. Today, we have with us Professor Chinmay Tumbe. He is currently the assistant professor in the economics area in IIM Ahmedabad. His field of research includes urban economics, business and economic history, as well as migration studies. He has authored a book, India Moving, A History of Migration, that was published in the year 2018. His recent paper, Urbanization, Demographic Transition, and the Growth of Cities in India, explores the relationship between urbanization and economic growth and asks why some Indian cities urbanize slowly and some grow faster than the others. We're very happy to have you with us here today, sir. This session will have the talk followed by a Q&A session which will happen after the talk. Over to you, sir.
Hi, thanks a lot for inviting me. I was at Ashoka University just earlier this year for a different event. So always happy to be with among the bright students of Ashoka University. It's when I was there in Jan, of course, nobody would have imagined a pandemic back then with such a massive repercussion on economies around the world, on health systems, etc. So it's obviously very surreal times that we live in. So today what I'm going to talk about is two themes which I've been working on for almost a decade, which is migration and urbanization, and kind of connect it with what we've been seeing during the pandemic. And as you would appreciate, we did have, along with a sort of health crisis, we've had a migration crisis in India from about end of March to the month of May. Some would say it's still lingering on. So you're want to make some sense as to, how do people move in India? What is the sense? What is the scale? Which cities are growing fast? And try and make some sense of what we saw during the pandemic, and how one should be taking into account migration, urbanization, or how one should be thinking through migration and urbanization as processes during the time of a pandemic. Okay. So I'll just take a line. I have some slides and so on, and I'll be talking less because we're happy to take questions. But all three, that is migration, urbanization, and pandemics, are not new concepts in India. In the sense that India has had bouts of urbanization, de-urbanization throughout history. India, as I've argued in my book, India Moving, A History of Migration, has had a long not of migration from ancient times to the present. And pandemics have also affected India in the past. And this is something which not many people know of. You must have read now in the newspapers aspects of the stuff like the Spanish flu. Nothing Spanish about it. Let's call it the Influenza Pandemic of 1918-20. Lesser known is the plague pandemic, between mainly the first 2 decades of the 20th century, devastated India. There were also the cholera pandemics before that, which devastated India. So India was heavily battered by pandemics in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this and its connection with migration and urbanization as well, because it's important to know the history. One of the things I want to leave a thought out here in this group is that it's extremely important to know the economic and demographic history of India as an economic student, especially. Right? And so that's one of the things I want to leave with you towards the end, because clearly, if one had been following what had happened back in the day in the late 19th and early 20th century, we would have taken quite drastically different decisions in March, which would have not only saved some people but also saved a lot of inconvenience that we saw. All right, so let me just start with some slides. Right. So I'm going to start with this picture, just taken long back in the 19th century. And this picture is, it's a painting which is published in London, the Illustrated London News. And it says modes of traveling in India. So this is how people move. Migration essentially is about movement of people. And you'll see, they have these pictures like tramps, pilgrims. There's also a traveling beggar. different modes of traveling. And of course, you have the elephant, which is prominent. And then you have the railways, which is like this big thing. And of course, this was celebrating colonial rule, and that the railways, which the British had introduced, had kind of superseded everything else that was there, in the subcontinent. Now, the railways, of course, did not start migration in India. It was been going on since ages. But what the railways did was to substantially increase the scale of the movement of people across the country. Right? And this, of course, led to a sense of unity among the people. So it helped the freedom movement later on. It also helped trade. It led to better price integration. A lot of economic history studies on how prices converged across India thanks to the railways. A lot of beneficial aspects of the railways, some bad aspects as well. Like any connectivity experiment would go, it also when you build anything that leads to the movement of people, it will also lead to the movement of pathogens, and that is how pandemics are also sort of created. So the railways obviously also help spread diseases and so on. And I'm talking about the rail. I'm starting this conversation on railways because what we saw in March, April, May this year was hugely dependent on whether the railway should have been kept open or not. Right? And this was a big public policy question that actually emerged. Now, this is a time in the late 19th century where, for the first time, the speed barrier in India, which was pretty much held by the speed of the horse, was broken. And for the first time, people could move very quickly. And this started intensifying a labor market. All of you know what the words labor market mean in a big way. And so, you had people moving to the industrial centers that were developing in Calcutta, in Bombay, and other cities. People going abroad, so people going to Calcutta to be shipped to Mauritius, Fiji, and all these other plantation economies out there. And it's in such a world that you come across varieties of families. And this is a particular family, not from the late 19th century. This is from the mid 20th century, which is based in the Konkan, which is on the west coast of India. And this is a family, this is based on my field research, where the gentleman that you see out here migrated to Bombay back then, for all his life, worked a lot out there. Why did he move there? Because of income, job opportunities. But he never settled down in Mumbai, right? So he always went there and he came back. And this is a rare photograph of the family in Mumbai, but otherwise the family was never there. And then his sons, who you see in this photograph, after his retirement, sort of took up his own, not the same job, but started that, kept on that tradition of migration from Konkan to Mumbai. And this is important because this is the particular pattern of migration in India, which I argue is fundamental to understanding work-related mobility in India. Okay. And to give you a sense of how dramatic that one picture is, the sort of reflection of how dramatic mass migration and persistent mass migration in India is, can be ascertained through sex ratios. And now some of you must have learned about sex ratios in a variety of courses, and you know that India has this serious problem of missing women, right? So India has this really crazy problem missing women. The sex ratios are something like 700, 800 females to 1,000 males. But what I'm pointing out to is a completely different phenomenon. It's the phenomenon of the missing men. So there are many source regions in India, like Ratnagiri, Udupi districts on the west coast, where the sex ratios, as you see in this chart, this chart, the x-axis is from 1901 to 2011, every census year since. The sex ratio has never been pretty much below 1,100 females to 1,000. Right? So this is not a 1 decade, 2 decade, 3 decade story. This is what we're talking is a 100-year-old story, more than 100 years actually, story of mass male migration to the cities, generation after generation, where the women grow up, looking after the lands, looking after the family back home, and the men go work, come back, they don't retire there, and then their sons go. Now, this is a completely different model of migration than what classical economic theories posit. So if you've done the Lewisian sort of theory of, surplus labor, that's the classic way of how countries develop. Surplus labor is transferred to the cities. And so, what happens is the wage differential gets closed down because people move from highly dense labor surplus rural areas, they move to cities. So the urban wages up and down and the sort of rural wages go up, and that's how the rural-urban differential starts to narrow. That is the Lewisian theory. Okay, then you have the Harris-Rodaro theory, which puts in unemployment, a variety of sort of model tweaking that happens there. But India does not quite belong to those patterns, where I have argued that the dominant mode of work-related migration is not permanent, it is circular. Right? So which means people go, but they also come back. So we're going to try and understand why that happens and why, of course, that matters tremendously when we start talking about urbanization and pandemics. Okay, so here's the map, and I'm going to spend a few minutes, on this map. It tells you the hotspots of migration in India today. Right? So the data for this map comes from the National Sample Survey, 64th round, 2007-8. So it's about 13 years old data, but not much has changed in my view. And the red spots, for example, if you see, places out here, the Eastern UP, Bihar belt, the red spots are basically places where 1 in 4 households or more have out migrants for work. Right? So this is the out-migration map of India. Where are people moving from? Right? And you'll see that it's interesting that you have an entire west coast from Ratnagiri, which is this district here, all the way to Kanyakumari in the south. Right? And this entire belt that you see here, which is Kerala, which is supposed to be India's most developed state in terms of human development indicator and so on, has mass migration, not within India, earlier within India, but now mainly towards the Gulf. Right? And so how does one describe such migrations? And if you see the bullet points on the left, I have called it the Great Indian Migration Wave, right? And the wave symbolizing that it's not new, it has happened since at least the late 19th century. In fact, most of the red shaded districts in India can trace their mass migration history to the late 19th century. So we're talking about a country with more than 100 years of mass migration, mass male migration, from particular pockets, but also very little migration from many other pockets. Right? So this is a country with extremes of mass out migration and very little migration. So on average, actually, when you look at the overall country, it turns out that India's mobility numbers are relatively low. Like, you find many studies which says that, in fact, economists used to often ask, why are people not moving in India? Well, that's not correct. There are people moving a lot in certain parts and very less mobility in others. So you see much of the Deccan Plateau out here is caught out of these migration streams. So what are these migrations? They are remittance based, which means people send back money home. So the source regions are completely remittance dependent. They're semi-permanent. They are not short-term seasonal. Short-term seasonal are construction workers, brick-kiln workers who work for 2-3 months outside, come back, who go through contractors, etc. Those come from mainly these circles that you see. So these circles on this map are the sort of waves of short-term seasonal migration, which are some of the most exploitative sort of migrations. People get exploited in these migrations. The poorest of the poor tend to move in these migrations, overrepresented by the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and so on. Right? But the migration that you're seeing here, the red shaded districts, are actually kind of different. Out here, it's not the poorest of the poor who move. In fact, it's the richest who tend to move more. It's the general and OBC category which is overrepresented. People do have some land and then move up. And so what sort of occupations do these guys work in? It's the complete urban informal economy, right? Which includes manufacturing in a huge way. But if you think of your Ashoka University campus, it would mean all the security guards, all the service professionals, even the caterers, the plumbers, this entire class of urban service professional service providers is basically coming from many parts of India, like you see up here. Right? And this is not the poorest, of the poor, when, as I said, and they're overwhelmingly male dominated. And I'll show you some, you've already seen that sex ratio chart on source regions. That does not mean that women don't move. In fact, if you just look at migration in India, there are about 300 million women migrants, because virtually every adult woman in India is a migrant. That is because of marriage. So you move across village boundaries and you're classified as a migrant. Right? But when you come to work-related migration, in the sense where you're going to get a job in the first place, there we find that over 80% are men. Right? And they do not get their wives along to the cities even after marriage. And that is fundamentally different from migrations that you see, for example, in China, which is the other large country that we should be comparing ourselves. Where in the last 30 years, China moved many more people away from farms to cities than in India. And they moved not only men, but also women, and for larger durations. Right? So there's a complete difference between what the Chinese migration system, if you want to call it, and the Indian migration system. Now, this general pattern that I've described, which I call remittance urbanism, which means people live in the cities not to invest in the cities, but to actually send back money home and build up a nice little nest egg back home, right? So the whole migrant psychology in India, for a huge segment, the numbers are staggering. We're seeing about 100 million circular migrant workers in India, most of them within states, but then of course a lot of interstate as well. Uh, and this is a very large number. This we're seeing is about a quarter of the workforce. Uh, Constant circulation occurs for reasons both in the source region and in the destination, right? Which means in the source region, classically, there are gender norms which say that women should not move and so on, the particular roles that women have to take up in the villages. But source region, because, for example, housing is very expensive. For example, if you go to the Gulf, you can't get citizenship, so you have to come back. So there are reasons both in the source and destination regions which cultivate these circular migration strategies in India, which are staggering. And this is very important to understand when we start talking about lockdowns and pandemics and so on. Now, this is just to compare urbanization and migration in India, right? Because this talk is about three things: urbanization, migration, and pandemics. And you'll see that the urbanization map of India, the light colored shades are basically districts with less than 20% migration, urbanization. There's this huge circle in the middle of India out here, right, which is very less urban. And this, limited extent of urbanization here is reflected, of course, in mass out migration, but not necessarily. Right? So what determines this migration map is a lot of history. As I pointed out, it's where density was very high. The number one reason driving migration in India is high population density in rural areas. That is why we say that both Bihar and Kerala have high out migration. They are poles apart on development, but both have very high rural population density. And that's why they have this pressure to send out people. But there are also historic migration networks which were cultivated, which can help explain that. But if you see urbanization, this whole Tamil Nadu cluster out here in the south, this cluster from Ahmedabad to Bombay or Delhi to Jaipur, they're particular industrial corridors which is drawing in a lot of migrants. So India's geography of migration urbanization is that a large part of migrants come from this circle out here, and they move to Delhi, they move to Bombay, they move to some of the leading cities of India. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of urbanization migration, how this looks in India. So, for example, if you take the case of Mumbai, this is the heat map of migration in Mumbai. Where do migrants to Mumbai come from? Now, this is very old data. This is data from the 1990s, for the simple reason that the census data of India for 2011 has still not been fully released. So it makes it very tough to actually do research on migration in India. But from the 1990s data, you would see this clear thing about, if you thought that distance matters, that is a simple gravity model some of you might have heard of migration, which means the closer you are, closer to points, you'd find more migrants between those 2 points. It's not quite so. For example, you'd see Madhya Pradesh sends very few people to Mumbai compared to Eastern UP. Right? So Madhya Pradesh is much closer to Mumbai, but Eastern UP sends many people. And why is that? That's because of networks. Because migration, not only in India, but across the world as well, happens through informational networks that are sort of created, which sort of drive down the costs of living in the city, because you share food, you share accommodation, you share a variety of things. And that's what makes it so simple for people to come. Note, most of these migrations in India, the bulk of migration in India, do not come through contractors. Right? So they're coming through family, friend networks. And of course, people who come from contractors are working in different jobs like construction and so on, and are relatively much more disadvantaged to start. This is a city, close to where your university is based, Delhi, again from the 1990s dated, but you see it's so different, right? It takes people from the Gangetic heartland into Delhi. This is Kolkata, which you'll see, it's the same, the graphs show the same legends. So basically the Kolkata, you'll see it's much less than Mumbai, Delhi. It's, in fact, as a city, it's one of the slowest growing cities of India. And it draws in people pretty much from around itself. In fact, a lot of people leave Calcutta itself to go to other cities. And then you have Surat out here, which is also, you should know, India's fastest growing major city of the last 4 decades because of its diamond and synthetic textile industry. And it draws in people not only from Gujarat, from Bihar, and all, but there's one district out here called Ganjam in Orissa, which sends out, which has been sending out 100 years back, people to Burma, and now they send a lot of people working in Surat. Right? This is to give you a flavor of different strands of migration corridors in India. where once a network is established, because what does a network do for an economic student? It basically reduces the costs of living. Right? So that's the power of the migration network, where you'll often see particular corridors develop. Right? Internationally, for example, Punjab to Canada. Right? Why do so many people, and it's not all over Punjab, a few districts from Punjab like Jalandhar, Hoshiarpur, send out a lot of people going to Canada, to Italy, because they understand how that migration can work, and then they get their people over. Similarly for internal migration. Okay. So types of migration in India, I explained the first part, which I believe is the most important thing to understand migration in India, is how long are people migrating. Example, if you move for even more than a year, you would be considered as permanent in sort of my categorical sense. But if you look at semi-permanent, these are the security guards on your campus, for example, who are spending about 9 to 10 months or even 11 months of the year there, but spending a few weeks, 1 month going back home and then coming. And when do they go back home? Usually June, before the sowing season, so that they can help on the farm and then come back in August, September. So that's the migration. So India also has a migration calendar. There are reasons for migration. So you all have moved to, or usually go to your college. So you're a student migrant, then you're a work-related migrant, marriage-related migrant. So variety of reasons. It could also be for variety of political disasters, for example, natural disasters that lead to more migration. And if you look at, I've talked about gender, more men tend to move on work and so on. Also on the basis of caste, the general category OBC is more represented in such streams of migration. In religion, I would say region is much more important than religion in driving migration. So for example, you'll see that the Muslims, for example, are much more likely to migrate in Kerala and Eastern UP than non-Muslims. But Muslims in Western Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest concentration of Muslims in India, has relatively very less out migration. Right? So it's the region. In a region where people have historically been moving, it's almost like a migration culture. You grow up seeing everyone around you moving. Right? For example, the peer pressure that you all as economic students do. You see around, many people are applying for PhDs, many people are applying for PhDs abroad. So there's a peer pressure for you as well to behave in a certain way. And that's true of migration. People see how others are moving, and then they choose similar destinations. Now, as an economic student, the wage differentials is the classic factor. And if you ask any migrant why are they working in a place, they'll say, paid bharna hai. We have to fill our stomachs, and that is why we come. We need to earn money. But when you dig deeper, it's not just an economic factor that leads to migration. Right? And for that, you need to spend time with migrants, understand what they're going through. So the city classically is also a place of where migrants get a lot of anonymity. So back home in the village, you're under the constant gaze of all the taboos, traditions of society, and that you kind of live much more freer in a place that you're completely new in, right? And so this anonymity is fantastic for especially people who want to break away from caste barriers. Right? And so that is why Ambedkar famously had said that migration is the best thing possible because it kind of liberates your soul. There's peer pressure, networks, variety of other things. And then classically, what is termed as push factors, right? So there's a drought, there's a particular cyclone which hits coastal Orissa. So migration then is a very stable strategy. So people are making very rational choices. It's not that people from Bihar who move out, do better if they had stayed there, because it's so volatile. Agriculture in India is so volatile that even this uncertain nature of work in cities is relatively safer than what people often experience back home. Okay, so in India, you should know that people are responding to wage differentials. So Delhi, Goa, for example, the richest states of India, receive a lot more migration than Bihar and UP, which are the poorest states, and they send out. Right? So if you look at per capita income on the x-axis, the richer states basically get more people. The poorer states have to actually send out more people. Right? So this is data from the economic survey. This was when Dr. Arvind Subramanian, who I believe is with you now, was the chief economic advisor, and we had actually worked together to come up with this particular chapter 12 in this particular Now, if you look at rural-urban migration in India, I just wanted to point out to one figure, which is this 78. Right? Let's talk about it as 80 and 80 million. Believe it or not, there is a lot of rural to urban migration in India, 80 million people. but there's also a lot of urban to urban migration, right? And so that's something which people don't often realize, because classically economic models is all about rural to urban migration. But in India, you also have people moving, like all of you, I think, I would assume, living in cities and moving to other cities, right? Now, think of what that does to urbanization as a process, right? So urbanization is a process where proportionately the society becomes more urban. That means you want more people to leave rural areas and live in urban areas. So rural to urban migration leads to more urbanization. But urban to urban migration does not change urbanization, right? Because people are just moving within cities. But that is also migration. And so often people make this incorrect sort of statement that if in India the urbanization statistic is not moving, it must mean that there's no migration. But no, you can have a lot of migration just between cities and have no change in urbanization. So common fallacies when we talk about migration and urbanization. Okay, now I'm going to talk a bit about city growth, right? And this is very important, and this is how I'm going to start the discussion on pandemics. Okay? Now, this is a chart. I think hopefully all of you will, understand what it means. The x-axis is annual population growth, and it's a distribution chart. And what I've done is to take 350 odd cities of India. I've taken the data for the last 140 years, census data, and I've plotted, 4 curves. And the first curve basically is reflecting the growth rate, the annual population growth rate of the city between 1881 and 1921, right? So this is this green line, green curve that you see. And you'll see the average population growth rate of those cities in those 40 years was 0, right? Can you believe it? The average city in India just did not grow under the British 1881 to 1921. And you'll see that, of course, some cities grew, had positive growth, and some cities had negative growth, right? And so this is, you must ask, how is it possible that cities just don't grow? And so here's when we really start talking about pandemics or even epidemics. And that is that before 1920, India's demographic growth was constrained by extremely high death rates. But believe it or not, death rates were high across the world, across the board. But death rates in India actually increased between 1881 and 1920. Right? And why, you should ask, why did this happen? It happened because of pandemics. Right? And so this is something which you would never learn in an economics course. You would never learn even in a history course in India, that India was battered by pandemics. Even more than colonial rule, it was pandemics which I would argue, altered the course of urbanization migration in India in those 40 years. Now, the 2 pandemics which you should know are the plague pandemic, which first hit Bombay city, but really it affected Punjab and UP a lot more. And this lasted from roughly 1896 to about 1920s, mid-20s. And then you have the influenza pandemic, 1918-20, which is India's greatest demographic disaster till date. Right? It knocked off about 20 million people in a few months. Think about it. Right? Today, our COVID-19 death figure stands at close to about 40,000. That is, after 2-3 months, we've lost 40,000 people due to COVID-19. Now, go back 100 years, 1918, in the matter of this same time, say, from March to now, which is about 4 or 5 months, India lost about 15 to 20 million, right? So there's simply no comparison between COVID-19 and the disaster called the influenza pandemic of 1918. I mean, we're talking of a time when literally every day there were hundreds of thousands every day, right? So it's a completely different world, and it drastically altered the population of cities, and its impact was very different across India. So the influenza pandemic. So broadly, what I want to say is that this green line that you see out here is very unique because it was at a point of time when India was battered by pandemics, and it completely altered the course of urban growth in India for the next few decades because these cities were completely destroyed by population loss. And as an economic student, you should appreciate what pandemics do. Unlike war, other kind of disasters, unlike cyclones, unlike earthquakes, which destroy both capital and labor. So think of a production function, destroys both capital and labor. Pandemics only destroy on the labor end. Right, which means the buildings are intact, everything else is intact. Pandemics, unless they are riots or protests, everything else is intact. It's just that there are less people. Right? So there's a completely different impact of a pandemic on a particular economy. The good part in a very twisted way is that actually as more people die, those who are living have more bargaining power, and so wages can actually go up, right? And so labor can actually negotiate for higher. And that's exactly what we saw in the pandemics of the past. The bad news for the cities is that when you lose a lot of people, you lose all the power of agglomeration, right? Because cities thrive on agglomeration. So what these pandemics did was completely knock out a few cities. But it so happened that the plague and influenza pandemics of India in the late 19th and early 20th century hit western and northern India much more than southern and eastern India. Right? And so not surprisingly, one of the reasons why South India, I would argue, got a head start compared to other places is because the pandemic spared them. I'm not going to go as to why the pandemic spared these regions. It's not something that the governments out there back then did. Kind of luck, you can call it luck. But it's a fact that cities in the south grew almost more than 1 percentage point higher than cities of the north in that particular period. Okay. Now, one way to understand this is to look at maps of cities in India between 1901 and 2011. Right? And so note, this is the map on the left is 1901. That's not how India looked, obviously, in 1901. So I've just taken the cities and put them on the map of India today in 2001 boundaries as to how they would look. Okay, and red is basically large cities, and you'll see that in 1901 there were a lot of cities in the north, right? The blue color ones, and you would think that North India actually has more cities or larger cities than the bulk of India, right? So Northeast, not much in any case. Okay, and the largest cities back then were the 3 port cities of the British, that is Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, right? And Delhi is actually pretty much nowhere. Cut to 2011 and you find Delhi and the regions around Delhi constitutes India's largest urban center. You still have Kolkata, Mumbai, but then you have these 3 important clusters here, which is Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai. And so what we've seen is this dramatic collapse of this entire region out here, right, in relative terms, and other cities, other parts of India have grown much faster. And I argue that one of the reasons this switch happened was because of pandemics. That is, pandemics knocked out the population of cities in these places. To tell you, just Agra, for example, in the influenza, lost more than 10% of its population. That's a huge number to lose in the matter of a few months and not replenished later on. Right? So we have had examples of pandemics altering the course of urban growth, urbanization in India. Did pandemics change migration patterns? Not dramatically, because as I showed you, migration patterns have been substantially similar across time. But what's interesting is that at the time the pandemic came first, right, there was obviously reverse migration. Okay, I'm going to talk about this now and build it into what we saw this year. So this is, for example, a picture of 1897. Okay, and this is a picture of people, boarding a train trying to get out of the city. Right? And for any of you who saw visuals of Delhi bus station, it's very similar. Right? So this is pretty much what people throughout history have done. When there's an epidemic, when there's a pandemic, people try and want to get back home. It's the most basic response of human beings. But why is this response even more highly felt in India? It's because these are not just migrants who have just who have lived in the city for a long time and invest in those cities. These are migrants to what I call as belonging to the Great Indian Migration, which means these are circular migrants who have one leg in the city and one leg in the village. In fact, they have the social security in the village and the economic security in the city. So what happens then in a pandemic situation is that, of course, a lot of people go back. Now, here's the hard trade-off policymakers have to make. That is, if people do go back, there's a danger that they can take the disease back with them. And that's pretty much what we've seen across the world. Every pandemic has to happen through the movement of either people or the vectors that carry the disease, which means any pandemic curtailment management strategy has to involve the restriction of the movement of people. And so it is in that context in which, on March 24th, the government not only announced a complete lockdown, but most importantly, shut down the Indian railway system for many months. In fact, it's still not fully on back now, right? But you'll see that the anticipation should have clearly been that people will try and go, right? Now, actually, it turns out that we do have examples from history where the railways was shut down and it did not work, right? So it's not so much in India, but in China. So during the same plague event, not in this year, but in 1911, the Chinese authorities actually shut down the railway system for the same reason as the Indian authorities today, for not to spread the disease. What happened? China, like India, by the way, also has this floating population where people go back every New Year. They got very lucky this year. Most of them go back at the end of December, so they had already gone back when the coronavirus outbreak got a big spread in January. So China did not see or did not have the need, because most migrant workers were already back for their 1 month long holiday, which is at the end of the year. So tens of millions of people use the trains in China to go back before the outbreak of this epidemic. Right? But in India, it's not the case, because the epidemic started and there was this rush to go back. Now, as it turns out, 100 years back, when they shut down the railways, people just still continue to go back. And that's the thing about migration, that is, when you have this massive circular migration, the psychology of migration is such that you just want to go back home. In fact, the stated responses of migrants in India at that time and today is that if you want to die, if you're going to die anyways, you might as well die in your hometown. Right? Coupled with the fact that there are absolutely no assurances given to migrants as to how one might live in the city without any work for an indefinite period of time. Because note, initially the lockdown in India was announced for 21 days, but it kept getting reversed. And so there was a lot of frustration among migrant workers, and that is why we saw this massive walk back home, massive sort of trek back home, many people dying along the way, just like 100 years back in China, people made this long walk. And that time in China, it was winter, and so many people died of exhaustion and the cold rather than the epidemic. Right? So what should have been done would have been, considering the history of migration, the psychology of migration, it would have made more sense to give a short window of time, like governments around the world did before shutting down the air system. They allowed students to go back home, for example, in many countries. The UK government did that. We should have given a few days. We had that planning, time period between March 15th and March 24th to allow people to go back and then shut down the railways. If we had to shut down the railways at all, in my view, we should never ever shut down the railways completely, because it leads to more problems of people being stranded at railway stations and giving sort of more density areas for epidemics to work on. Right? So this is very interesting, because you can see now the link between pandemics, between migration, and what one can learn actually from history in the case of India and for that matter in China. Right? So this is the image that we see today. That is the coronavirus, and classic images of people walking back. Now, coming again to this trade-off of what should have been done, it is of course very easy to say this on hindsight, though I was arguing, as somebody working in migration, I've been arguing this throughout. The eventual strategy of sending back people home in May, at a time when the infection rate was much higher than it would have been in March, obviously clearly did not make sense. So the only rational one can still make or sort of articulate is that it must be the case that you wanted to buy some time so that regions back home could ramp up testing facilities, quarantine facilities, so that people, when they went back, could access those. Now that you could say is a valid argument, but the bigger point is that India simply does not have a social security system for most of our migrants, which is called as circular migrants. So that brings me to this point of the invisible migrant worker in India, who does not have any political voice, because you're voting usually in your source state. You do not even have a ration card, so you can't access social security in your destination. So that is why your living is very precarious. The minute you don't have an income, the minute your landlord or landlady tells you to leave the house, you're on the road. Right? And so unfortunately, we saw these scenes playing out in April and May, which was clearly avoidable with some planning and with some understanding the psychology of migration. Which means the learning is that anytime in the future you allow migrants to go back home a few days before the lockdown is actually announced. There is, however, as an economics student, even more pragmatic reason as to why migrants should be given the option to go back home. And that is purely from an economic argument. And this is it, that because migrants are anyways going to go back home, it makes more sense for them to go back home before and then come back after the lockdown is over, rather than have them go back after the lockdown has been released. And now you can appreciate that India's economic recovery this year is hugely delayed by the absence of migrant workers in our cities today. And so we are still working at about a 10 to 20% shortage of manpower, woman power in cities because most of the migrants are back home. Right? And if people had gone back, they would have had 2 or 3 months of rest, anxiety would have been much lesser, and you would have seen more people actually coming back. No, this is also a class of people who cannot work from home and who need to be on site. There are also arguments that this is a great opportunity for rural areas to absorb migrant workers. That is simply not happening. Migrant workers need to come back. They're going to get higher wages, and many of them will bargain for higher wages now in the coming months. Right? So if you look at policy options today in the context of a pandemic for migrants, three things have to really be done. One is hopefully happening with this one nation, one ration card, which means migrant workers in India should be able to access any benefit anywhere in India. Right? So this is paramount. And so, I can talk more about this later. Second, our housing policies in India have been mostly in the context of ownership-based housing, not rental housing. Right? And so that makes a huge difference because rental housing in India is the requirement for migrant workers, but it's simply the supply of such housing stock is severely constrained. And so we seriously need to rethink how housing supply is delivered in India. And for a particular class of workers in this particular lockdown, we saw that contractors simply deserted them, and there was absolutely no accountability of contractors in supporting migrant workers during the crisis. So these three, are the key things which one has to work on in the coming months to strengthen these processes so that migrants also have a stake in the city. And it's very simple. If migrants invest in the cities, even a little bit, cities also will benefit much more. I'm going to end with this last slide. And this is because, you're economic students, you should know economic history. This is a chart which tracks GDP growth on the x-axis and inflation as proxied by the deflator on the y-axis. Not for 10 or 20 years, but about 120 years, right? And which is the worst year of India in macroeconomic terms? It is 1918, right? And what was 1918? It was the pandemic year. Right? So 1918 is a complete outlier, right? So you see this, these things where India got minus 10% GDP growth and almost 30% inflation. That's what a pandemic can do. It can completely knock out supply chains, drive up prices, and still not produce anything. I mean, classically, when you have high prices, you have a booming economy. Here we are talking about the classic sort of stagnation, right? That's because there's simply no workers because mortality is very high. So production processes are sort of affected and you get rampant inflation. Right? Now we know, now this is a chart of India. The question is, where is India going to be in 2020? Right? And this is a really, big question to ask for an economics student. We know we are in a recession. This is the worst year probably in Indian history, in independent Indian history. But is it going to be 5% negative or 10% or even worse? That is really the question. We know that inflation is not going to really go to 30%. Right? And so there might be some supply side constraints bidding up prices. Food prices, as you know, are slightly on the higher side right now. But inflation, we can rest assured that it's going to be hopefully in this band of, about 3 to 7%. So nothing too much to worry on inflation. It's really the growth, the livelihoods lost that matters. And here is why the migration and urbanization question is very important, because the faster the migrant workers can come back and work safely, the sort of more the blue dot is going to come to the right side, right? Which means the economy is going to come back on track and start growing relatively more. It's going to be negative this year, but the question is, how negative do you really want to take it? Right? And that is why smart management of a pandemic actually often boils down to smart management of migration, because we have to understand that a large part of India's economy works on migrant workers. And that is why the high priority right now is to devise a completely safe strategy of getting migrant workers back on work. It will help them. But above all, for that to happen, a lot of incentives have to be given. It would mean insurance, it would mean the employer or the government would have to pay for testing, for health benefits. It's also a great opportunity for a complete rehaul of the health system of India, and of course giving migrant workers much more visibility. Okay, so with that, I'll end. I'll be happy to take a question. This is the book I've written. You'll see the forward is by one of your faculty members now. I also run a social media handle on business and economic history. Unfortunately, very few university departments in India teach this, but we do that at IIM Ahmedabad. And I do run a history internship. It's ideally pitched at master's level students. Occasionally, an undergrad student also comes. But it's for people who want to explore what is business and economic history, and you get an opportunity to spend about 2 months at IIM Ahmedabad and engage with the subject. Some of them have even written papers and so on. So I'll end here. Be more than happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor, for shedding light on some very important processes of migration and helping us understand how the pandemic has also affected it. So for the question and answers, shall we go in order? I'll read it out for the benefit of the audience and you can answer them.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question is, states like Kerala, which have better sex ratios than the rest of the country, to what extent could this be attributed to migration?
I mean, Kerala, when you talk about sex ratios, when you're talking about discrimination and so on, you need to look at the age group sex ratios. So if you look at 0 to 6, 0 to 10 age group sex ratios, Kerala does quite well compared to other states. And that is really to say that, Kerala is much better in terms of health, female autonomy and so on compared to other states. But you can never, I mean, this is a lesson for all of you, never take the aggregate sex ratio in India to talk about gender discrimination. For the simple reason, because between age groups of 20 and 40, almost all the variation in India on sex ratios comes from migration. Right? And so not surprisingly, Kerala's overall sex ratio, if you're just looking at the overall sex ratio, it's very high because it's a female surplus because the men are in the Gulf. So yes, never look at aggregate sex ratios. If you want to cut out the migration noise, focus on the 0 to 6, 0 to 10 age group sex ratio. That's why people work with age group sex ratio.
Our next question is, what is your view on the proposed 3 capital idea in Andhra Pradesh? What are the implications of this for urbanization in the state? Is it a good way to bridge the pronounced spatial gap in productivity in India and hence the models for other states to adopt? On a related note, do you think there is a need to focus government policy towards creating new cities rather than encourage movement to existing cities?
Yeah, thanks, Karthik. That's a good question. My view is very simple. If you look at India, every state, in my view, and this is an old question, do you want a few big cities or do you want many even-sized cities, right? And obviously most people think, let's have even-sized cities, sort of classic spatial distribution, kind of have every place, have something. Doesn't work like that. There's something called a Zipf's law. It's about, ranking of city size, which, works throughout the world. And so you will have some extraordinarily large cities anywhere in the world, and that's a good thing. Having said that, because we are a federal system with state as a unit of analysis, I believe every state of India should have at least one large metropolis. So unfortunately, we don't have that. For example, even in Bihar, UP, Patna and Lucknow are still suboptimal. So every state having one large metropolis, if you want to have a push on that. In any case, most state governments, the capital is the largest city. It's just so happened because so much of government jobs and so on get concentrated. But beyond that, to have many small towns, small city, every district, I think defeats the purpose completely. This was, in fact, this has been tried. It's not that I'm talking of some theoretical thing. This was pretty much the Nehruvian vision. Those towns which they started, some of them were mineral towns like Rourkela and all those things, Bokaro. They had a particular objective, but they never grew like Surat. They never grew like Mumbai. Chandigarh, your classic example. It's only growing now to some extent, but again, the growth rates of Chandigarh have never been like Surat, Mumbai, or even Bangalore, Hyderabad, and they have not really absorbed. I mean, we want cities to absorb migration from rural areas because that's what India's transformation is going to happen. It's going to happen when people from villages move to cities, and so for that, organic growth seems to me the more not correct but more feasible way. It's very tough to create cities. This is, for example, the Paul Romer method, right? Charter cities and so on. Very little impact in Africa, what they've done. So interesting ideas. I don't have very clear answers, but in my sense, the more you try to intervene in market forces, in the spatial allocation of resources, it usually backfires. In the specific case of Andhra Pradesh, I think there's a very strong case for having 3 different places. If you know what they're doing, they're separating out, executive, legislative, judiciary, for the simple reason that you'll get some jobs. So if Kurnool has the judiciary system, that's good because they'll get a few jobs. So in that sense, I think it's a good idea. In any case, what they were doing earlier, Amravati had huge issues with land acquisition and so on. So this seems to be, but clearly what's happening there is very political. So it's almost like an ego issue. So it's whatever is happening is not either Amravati or now this 3-city thing is not happening on any sound rational. It's only on a one-upmanship, which is unfortunate. But in the case of Andhra Pradesh, maybe this three capital idea might work. Note, it's not 3 capitals; they're 3 completely different centers, and that might be interesting. So if you can have, like you have Kota in Rajasthan, which is this town for educational services, right? Everyone goes to Kota to crack the big institutions. If you have Kurnool, if you try and make Kurnool as a judicial setup, law colleges, and make it as like this law hub of India, why not? That's the power of agglomeration. But if you just have one high court and nothing else, it's not going to do much for that place. So a strategy which builds on that particular sector and then adds on to it is much more likely to work.
So we have a couple of questions that I'll just ask together. One is from Rochak. Can these migration remittances cause social mobility for the lower classes back home? And the other is, if a person shifts due to economic, political disasters, how likely are they to go back post-disaster? And is there any data on this?
Yeah, I'm usually very gung-ho on migration, voluntary migration, not trafficking and so on, obviously. In that migration, the evidence is very clear, people benefit. Most people who move do benefit. I mean, obviously, a lot of people who also don't. But when you talk about do remittances cause social, lots of studies. I have a paper on remittances. There's some good papers on impact, cutting out selection bias and so on. Remittances work. It lifts people up. Now, the thing, of course, is that, as I pointed out, the richer people are more likely to move out. So while remittances reduces poverty, it increases consumption, it also increases inequality because the money is going to people who already had some money to start with. So think of it as a ladder. Remittances coming, everyone going up, but the rich are actually going up much. This is a classic case of the pie is increasing thanks to the remittances, but they share how much that is. So social mobility, upward mobility, yes. Is inequality changing? Not so much. In fact, I would argue that remittances often increases inequality, like it has done in Kerala. In Kerala, for example, consumption Gini is one of the highest. That is, we're saying Kerala is one of the most unequal states of India. Think about it, right? A communist kind of place. But that's because one of the huge drivers of that has been international remittances. Relatively rich people are going to the Gulf, they're sending back money, they're getting richer. We did a study on a particular village in Konkan, and we tracked it over 5 decades using baseline data of the census in the 1960s. And we found the same thing. Migration is great for upward mobility, but not necessarily drastically changing landholding structures, inequality in the source. Right? So it depends on what you're looking at. If you want to cut down on absolute poverty, great. If you want to be a radical and completely alter traditional relations, caste relations, not so much. Though people get a lot of, you can assert, in the study we did, people also noted strong sense of assertion. That is, because of the money through remittances, we can now talk about issues which we could never talk about earlier. And I'm talking about in the case of Ratnagiri, Mahars, Dalits, and so on. So if you're talking about social mobility as getting a voice, yes, money talks and remittances helps in a big way. This is also true of the Dalit diaspora in Punjab. The Ravidasyas who are in Spain, they send back a lot of money, and so that's also helped. On political disasters, as I said, even the normal migration data is very bad in India because we get it very late. Census 2011 data is just not come out properly. Even today, we're talking about 9 years after the census, and the first data release was in 2018. So political, economic disasters related migration, there are questions in the national sample survey which do this, but those are very thin. You can imagine what happens. Suppose there's a dam project, people get displaced. Now, those guys will be living in a particular cluster in the city. So when you do these national sample surveys, because these are stratified samples, if your sampling design just happens to miss a particular cluster, that's it. You'll assume you'll get 0. You'll say that nobody in India has been displaced by dams. Right? So this is a problem when you do large-scale surveys and you miss out completely localized the assumption would be that damn displaced people would be spread across in all the places of India. That's when you could get some survey-based evidence, but you can't. So that is why these migrations are not amenable to survey-based, census-based research. You have to do field surveys. You have to go to the settlements. They will not be randomized. You can say goodbye to all your good methods in economics. You just have to go talk to people, understand the issues, and write a nice report. That is how studies are done on, R&R, that is refugee and rehabilitation, trafficking. So all these, disaster kind of migrations, Rohingya migration, for example, you just have to go to a particular settlement and talk to them. Unfortunately, there's nothing else that you can do. There are numbers, given by NGOs and so on. I don't trust those numbers. But yeah, so it's a very tough field to work in, but a great field to work in, right? Because whatever you say is your kind of study, because nobody else can say the same thing because they don't have access to the same data. In contrast to census, NSS, IHDS, everyone has access to those data. So there's nothing very novel. I mean, many people can do the same thing that you're doing. So this is the trade-off in how you do research.
So we have a lot of questions coming in. Should I take the anonymous questions at the end if you have time?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the next question is from Adit. Given that lower agricultural productivity is one of the reasons for many to migrate in the first place, what is the impact of circular migration on agricultural productivity? Do we see any systematically higher returns to agriculture in migrant households?
Great question. Depends. There's one study on Punjab. They looked at the Punjabis from the Pakistani side who went to UK, compared it with Punjabis on the Indian side. Interestingly, the Indian guys' agricultural productivity went up because apparently of the remittances sent from UK, Canada, and so on. On the Punjabi side, it did not. Right? And so there's an interesting study in the 1970s which argued that just remittances does not increase agricultural productivity. It has to be remittances plus a conscious effort to tap those remittances into investment. Right? But my sense, and I've written on this, is that there is very little link between remittances and increasing agricultural productivity. And you don't need to do much research. Just think about it. Bihar has been sending out people for more than 100 years. Agricultural productivity is still pretty much in very dire straits in Bihar. So if remittances could dramatically change rural landscapes in terms of agricultural productivity, you would not see that. In fact, what you'll see is that people start owning land purely on account of status reasons. In fact, many times people shirk from investing in agriculture because you get a little bit for your family. Bulk of your income is now coming from outside. So there's a very interesting contra effect. Note, this is a case where you're actually getting richer, but not through agriculture, through money from outside. So your disposable income is increasing, but not your actual income or real income in that case. So there's interesting economic sort of ways to look at, but my answer would be no. The short answer is remittances do not seem to boost agricultural productivity. In fact, often people lose interest in actually investing in agriculture because they have this safe, secure means of money coming in from outside.
Couple of questions here appear to be related from anonymous attendees. I'll ask them together.
Sure.
Will there be a significant psychological shock from the current ordeal the migrant workers went through that might deter future migration patterns? And another is there now an opportunity to develop local industries in tier 2 and tier 3 cities for a more inclusive growth, especially since India has strong supply networks as raw material and agricultural goods get transported efficiently?
Yeah, the second part is very simple. No, you might get 1 or 2 centers which are making PPE kits and very specialized things for the stuff that's coming, which people are moving away from China. So, but broad-based will tier 2, tier 3 towns outpace now the big cities? No. Now large cities have been growing faster and they're going to continue to grow faster in terms of the migration part. Will people now not return to cities? No, they'll come back. They'll come back for the simple reason there are no jobs in the villages, and you can't create that many jobs in the villages of India today. When we're talking in Bihar, we're talking of 3 million people who went back. You can't create so many jobs, and you'll see newspaper reports every day saying that people just want to come back to cities. Yes, there has been a psychological shock, but at the end of the day, the migrant will tell you paid bharna hai, so you have to come back. There's absolutely no there are no two ways about it. I should also point out, I've been studying the subject for a long time, and I've met migrants who have returned because they were either unsuccessful in the city or there was a recession. So this is not the first time migrants have gone back. Many people have said that we never go back to the city. Next year they've gone back. What is unique this time is that everywhere people have gone back at the same time, right? And often through very hard conditions. So return has always been there, but you're right that there has been a psychological shock, and that's why people will take more time to come back. But yes, there might be a few people who don't come back, but if you see the numbers, at least 20 million people who went back, as per my estimates, most of them will come back. But for that, there has to be a lot of security guarantee about working conditions, health conditions, and you will not get growth back on track in India until they come back. So it's a kind of situation where migrants also need the money and the industries need the workers, without which things won't be produced. So in both ways, the migrants will come back. In fact, they can make a lot of money right now if they come back now, right? Because there's a shortage. So this is the time when one can actually improve bargaining power and fight for wages. This is, by the way, what happened during the plague in Bombay. Some of the first things about India's labor movement started in the plague, where cotton mill workers in Bombay were desperate for the workers. They've all gone back home. And then they had to literally pamper the workers. Jamshedji Tata, famously said, "We are in a sad situation where the employer has to be thinking like an employee. Basically, we are begging for people to come back." So this is actually also a time when migrant workers have a lot of negotiating power, and they should use it smartly to get a lot of incentives at the work.
The next question is, going ahead, should India focus on leveraging the networks and supply chains already in place in major cities by developing them further, or should we start developing tier 2 or tier 3?
Yeah, I think we just finished this one. Yeah.
Okay. From Adit again, many of the regions with lower migration on the map, like the dry regions of Maharashtra and Western UP, are dominated by landed groups like Marathas and Jats. We see the lack of migrant networks for these landed groups as one of the reasons behind complaints of economic disenfranchisement expressed through demands for reservation.
I mean, that's a very good observation, but I would not make too much about it. I mean, landed groups are everywhere. I'll take the Konkan region, for example. There also you have the Marathas and Mahars, and there also you have the Marathas. 80% of most villages would be Marathas. But there's mass migration from the Konkan region. And has it changed? It has given voice to the marginalized castes, but it has not dramatically changed land holding structures and so on. So I think the sort of demand for reservations coming from a very different end. That is, a sense of relative economic disenchantment and so on. Not so much because of migration. I would discount migration as a role in this. I'm based in Gujarat. Gujarat has the same thing. In the Hardik Patel's movement wanted again reservation and so on. It's not coming so much from migration or the lack of it. In fact, if anything, the voice in the first place, the political voice in the first place, is coming, maybe, this is purely speculation, from some upward mobility in the first place, thanks to migration. And I'm saying this from the viewpoint of Gujarat, where the Saurashtra Patels have done quite well in the diamond industry of Surat, come up as a social group, and many of them are now voicing for more concessions in the political realm. So there could be a hypothesis that you need actually some amount of migration to come up rather than a lack of it. But again, I mean, it's a good question, but I wouldn't place too much emphasis on migration, and definitely I've not seen enough of this. I should just mention in passing, I do maintain a migration resource page. If any of you are interested, I'll share it in the chat screen. It's on my Google site, and that does include a bibliography of migration studies. There have been over 3,000 studies on migration in India in the English language alone. And people have looked at it from a variety of disciplines. So if you're really interested in migration, do look up the migration bibliography, and some of those studies might help you further.
The next question from Silakshana. You mentioned that Indian migration is dominated by men, but in China it is not so. Why?
Good question. Mao said half the sky is held by women. This was a famous line of Mao. They had, you realize, I mean, a lot of research now, communist states, for all their other flaws, worked quite well for women. This is true of USSR, this is true of Eastern Europe, this is true of China. This very strong emphasis on equality meant there were a lot of jobs which opened up for men. This is my reading of the situation. If you look at China itself, if you look at child sex ratios, China also has the issues of son preference. It is also a fairly patriarchal society in that sense, in a traditional sense. But there was a strong government emphasis, policy emphasis on creating equality at the workplace, jobs, and so on. And that is why, there's this easy sort of transfer of labor or female labor also. The other part is textiles. A lot of the Chinese growth of the last 4 decades came from the textile sector. And textiles historically has been able to absorb a lot of female labor. I mean, your Professor Ashwini Deshpande teaches you. And one of the things that's emerging in the female labor literature of India is that even if people want to work, there are not enough jobs for women where they can work in. So there's also a severe skill mismatch which is happening in India, which is why female labor force participation rates are so low. So it's almost like a chicken and egg problem. People are not coming because there are no jobs. There are no jobs maybe because not enough people are coming. But in China, at least in the last 4 decades, I would emphasize the unique role of the textile sector in drawing a lot of people. Look at South India. In Tirupur, for example, bulk of the labor force is women. These are female migrants who come from places around. Whereas in other places in the north, it's much less. So there are cultural factors at work, but there are also industry-specific factors. Look at Britain in the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. How women in Britain came up was also through the textile sectors. We sometimes think of the Industrial Revolution as men working in a factory. It was mostly women and children in the early 19th century. So that's unfortunately a sector. Bangladesh is another classic case. Huge employment of women, and that has helped. In Bangladesh has better indicators than India on many counts. So that this is clearly something which India has lacked in the last 3 or 4 decades. And we need, I've consistently been arguing, we need more female migration for work to our cities. And that also matters on housing. Our cities are not very safe, and we don't have, I mentioned lack of rental housing, but lack of rental housing for women in particular, right? And so we don't have women dormitories like in China. We've not really made cities inclusive enough for women. Maybe not in South India, but at least in West North for sure. So these are some of my observations on the India-China differences on women. Yeah.
The next question is from Raghav. There is a growing discussion on the need for some form of urban employment guarantee program. Such a program would stand to benefit workers in the informal sector. Could you comment on this? Also, is it not possible that it may further drive up migration?
That's a great point. To be honest, I've been thinking about this, big question. I have not yet seen any specific policy recommendations from any group yet. Maybe there are, many, and I've just not seen. And I would be curious to know what people are suggesting. But it is my general view that it is very tough to come up with an urban employment guarantee. You mentioned one reason that it forms an incentive for people to come, and most political parties are hostile to the idea of migration. So that is, of course, obvious political reason. But even if you, unlike Manrega, where you could easily provide something, in cities it's very difficult because the skill range is also much more complex. So it's not very clear to me how, even though it's a meaningful idea, whether it is practical as of now, maybe I've just not thought about it enough. But I'll be really happy to see people who are working on this and on what they're suggesting. So my view is that it's not practical, and it might make just more sense to give people a direct cash transfer than something of this sort. Because you're absolutely right that it will incentivize more migration at a time when most political parties don't want migration.
Next question is from Mansi. Can you tell us a bit about the environmental consequences India's large-scale urbanization? And does this pandemic or previous pandemics in India's history give us a chance to create more sustainable cities? We saw a lot of reports of cities healing, clearer skies, etc. Was this a temporary thing, or is the pandemic a chance to change how cities grow?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. In fact, I'm writing on pandemics in general, and you'll be seeing this soon in about a few months. Historically, the fight or the tension was always between epidemiology and economics, right? The epidemiologist saying lockdown, economists saying no lockdown. And now, like, what Mansi is saying is that there's this third E. It's not just the epidemiologists and economists, but there's also the environmentalists. And I think it's a really nice, three-way kind of approach, which is very useful to look at what's happening right now. And I absolutely agree that, those few days of clean air were very vital. And maybe we can start thinking of creative ways of, just mimicking the lockdown, even in non-lockdown times. That is, suppose everything is okay 2 years down the line, why can't we have an effective lockdown where everyone has to only walk or, completely every first Monday of the month or something like that? I mean, these are just, ideas on top of my head. So there's clearly some learnings that we need to take from the fact that we could actually massively reduce air pollution by just not doing anything. But the converse, of course, as we know, is that we can work from home, but the bulk of India cannot. And so economic growth, however you might not like it, is important at the kind of stage of development we are in, for the simple reason that, their livelihoods at stake. So while we might, like the nice air and so on, the fact is that during the lockdown, it was complete misery for millions of people who were trying to, make ends meet. And so the pandemic gives us an opportunity to realize that it is possible to have clean air. It is possible not to have massively depleting groundwater. There were very few water shortages this summer because the resource consumption had gone down and so on. And to creatively think, how can we, start actually managing our cities in a way that reduces resource flow tremendously? Because I work on urban economics as well, and I teach a course in urban economics here. So this is a question close to my heart. I think we need more studies, especially from students and so on, to see, what was the impact of the lockdown on a variety of sectors, from solid waste to water to air and so on, and to kind of start giving solutions as to how we can live in a smarter way going forward. From the history bit, environment, as I say, environmental concerns were not at the top of the agenda back then. Right? But it has to be said that pandemics are great for environmentalists, because if you get a minus 10% GDP growth, that's the best thing any environmentalist could ask for. If you're not going to consume too much, if you're going to produce very less, I do see it as a trade-off. That is, every time you get minus 10% GDP growth, you're actually saving the earth. So these are hard trade-offs that everyone has to make. But I tend to go more on the side of economists, because we are in a relatively poor situation as a country. That is, we need livelihoods for people to sort of meet their ends meet, and not put environment on the sort of back burner, but definitely emphasize more on the economy than the environment, given the state that we are in, because there are choices to make, and so that is how I would see it. But that's a great question, and it's a question which I've been thinking a lot on. And in fact, if some of you want to email me your thoughts on this, that would be great. But do read a lot on history. I think that's very important.
Next question. Could you expand more on what a social security system in India should include? Are there any takeaways from the Aadhaar system on what to include, exclude in the system?
Social security, very simple. All these years, people who work on migration have been arguing for a portable social security regime. I think that's coming closer to reality now. So we're very excited about it. There are a lot of concerns about Aadhaar, about privacy and so on, which are concerns are valid. But I do think now that almost everyone has an Aadhaar card, it will have to be through the Aadhaar system. And I do think, this one nation, one Russian card, I don't know how it is being envisaged. We'll get to know the exact details, I think, in a few months. But the Aadhaar card, I would imagine, is a pivotal instrument of that. And so I'm okay. I'm not an anti-Aadhaarist in a very strict sense. But there is a concern of data privacy. And you've seen in the last few months, in the name of helping people, you can access the names of literally lakhs of migrant workers in India on government websites today, right? And you can know their name, the skill, their address, their occupation, which is, to my mind, not great. You can't have names of people out there in the open that. And so, so that is definitely a concern. And hopefully, but this thing of portable social security. It should not be just be for ration. It should be for anything. You should be able to go to any place in India and do stuff seamlessly. That is the dream of a good social security architecture. But yes, I do think Aadhaar must be playing some important role in enabling us to get there. Note, this is, we are almost, what's more than 70 years since independence, and all these years, social security was tied pretty much to your place of birth. Right? So this is a hugely important step, and I should say, the credit to this really goes to Priya Deshinkar and a lot of researchers who worked on this in the 2000s, about 15 years back, and who consistently argued that, look, migration is not to be seen as a problem. We need to facilitate safe migration, and for that we need a portable social security. So yes, while it will hopefully come out and be rolled out soon, I think there's been a series of researchers over the years who have argued for this. So just like the Manrega, there was a book written by Ritika Khera, who was my colleague until a few months back, on the battle for employment guarantee. I think somebody should write the book on the battle for portable social security, because it's a very, very important step.
From Samuel, we have, should India get a new national policy on migrants before outlining social security packages for them?
As a policy, I mean, I don't know how much a policy per se sort of matters. There is something called as the Working Group Report on Migration. I was a member of that committee. This was chaired by Partha Mukhopadhyay. So if you go to my Google page, that working page report is already there. So in some sense, we already have a draft of a policy. Now, if you want to implement it as a policy, that's a different thing. But what we've said in that thing is, in that report, is that you don't want to, try and make a registration-based system where you don't want to impede the movement of people within the country. Right? And we saw like glimpses of that, when the UP Chief Minister said, oh, now whoever wants to take our labor has to ask permission. That is more bureaucracy. That is, more problems. So it has to be seamless. Let people move wherever they want to. There are some states in India which have special provisions. But beyond that, the policy should be to, I think the policy draft is already there. I think the specific question was, do we need a policy? I think the draft is already there. So whether we want to act on it or not is different. I have, however, been arguing for an interstate migration council. So as I said, most migration in India is within states, but there's also interstate migration. And what we saw in April, May was really that, because state boundaries were shut, it was the interstate migrant workers who were caught out in this crisis. And what a council like this would do, it kind of mimic the GST council, which is on the movement of goods and services, which is something like similar to that on the movement of people, to give real-time estimates on how many people from, say, Bihar are in UP and vice versa. Because a major problem in this crisis was that nobody knew how many people were there in other states. Like you're literally flying blind. And so an interstate migration council which has data, which ensures a fiscal architecture for ensuring portable social security. Because the problem I see in having portable social security is the finances. Why should the Maharashtra government pay for the Bihari worker in Mumbai? Right? So there has to be some sort of central backing, Bihar government backing, Maharashtra government backing to this arrangement. And that needs to be worked out through some sort of an interstate council. So more than a policy, I think an interstate migration council, which kind of deliberates on interstate migration issues, is a more practical thing. And that can be the nodal point to implement or smoothen out problems that come about in portable social sector.
From Mansi again, would you consider migration a positive or a negative thing for scheduled tribes? There's a chance for economic mobility, but you also don't want scheduled tribes to lose their forest rights and way of life.
Yeah, broadly, people should be allowed to live wherever they want, right? So that should be the overarching principle. So people want to live in villages. There's no one to force you to live outside. People want to live in cities. Nobody should be forcing you. Unfortunately, a lot of political parties do say, cities are only for us. We don't like outsiders. That should also not be there. The only argument against migration can be ecological in kind of biodiversity spot, like Nicobar Islands. You and I can't go to Nicobar Islands unless we have something called as a tribal pass. There are some parts of India which are restricted, where human beings cannot go in order to preserve the nature of them. But that argument, I believe, cannot be applied to cities, which are modern inventions. So you can't say Mumbai's ecology will collapse if more people come. No, that argument for me doesn't work. You can protect the ecology in many ways. So now the question on, should people migrate or not? What migration does is give you voice, right? And so in my view, the answer should be yes. That is, there should be more migration in the sense where, you can move as students, get an education, get a job, work for 10 years, and also go back. That is also a part of migration. But the more isolated communities are in India, they are doomed. As simple as that. So migration is a very pragmatic strategy for people to come up, because even if you want to protect your forest, you need to have a voice in Delhi or in the state capital that you're residing in. Right? And so you need to have those networks established. And that is why migration is important. Let me just throw you this one statistic. We say the urbanization rate in India is 31%, census 2011. The number for Brahmins in the IHDS, India Human Development Survey, is close to 50%, 46% or so. All India number 31%. What does that mean? 31% of Indians live in cities, as per some definition. For Brahmins, that number is close to 50%. For general category, it's about close to 40%. For OBC, it's close to 31%. For scheduled caste, it's close to 21%. And for scheduled tribes, it's about 10%. See the gradation, right? 10% scheduled tribes to 50% Brahmins. It's basically the guys who are ruling India have been able to leave the villages and prosper in the sense of, getting voice. Right? If you want voice in India, you have to have one leg at least in the city. Right? And that is why, the Ambedkarite earlier slogans were, educate, agitate, organize. And I would say migrate should be the fourth one. And that is what you're seeing in Dalit circles, for example, that go to US, get your education, and come back, because you get voice. If you go to US and come back to India, you have much more voice than if you're an academic or a researcher just in India. And so that is why migration is important for getting a voice. So to answer your question, I don't think people should be giving up their lands or anything like that. But if you want to protect your lands also, you need voice. And so it's important to build a community of people who, and that can happen only with migration. Right? And note, this social capital which has been built over generations, say among Brahmins, has been through migration. Right? In my book, by the way, there's a whole chapter called Migration and Capital, where I look at the migration of people like Marwadis, Gujaratis, Parsis, and the traditional business communities of India. And these communities have been able to hold on to so much of capital of India precisely through migration networks. And I've argued that it's precisely because of the lack of migration that capital has still not, really flowed to other communities. So that's how I would see it. No deliberate compulsion for any person to live where they can, but migration is a very powerful means of getting voice.
Next, the Delhi government briefly considered limiting access to Delhi hospitals to Delhiites exclusively. What are your thoughts regarding this inward-looking approach to resource allocation during times of a pandemic? And how would you think this would impact migration patterns as well as the central policy?
I think you have to see the very short-term thing. It must have been done just to have some allocation rule given you saw those few weeks where there was a massive rise in numbers. Now, if you have 15 deaths, or as they claim, which happened yesterday, it doesn't really matter where you're from. So as an allocation rule, which lasted for a few days, okay, like, there are very hard choices that governments have to make. But obviously, as a general rule, if you're going to, for example, this is, I think, very extreme case, which I think would have been already overturned. But state governments around India, across political parties, have the following on the political manifesto: 80% reservation for locals. Right? So Andhra Pradesh started this madness. Madhya Pradesh has it. Shiv Sena and one of the things about the charter of the coalition now ruling Maharashtra is reservation for locals. That is completely anti-constitutional. You cannot have reservations for locals. So I don't even know how they're doing it. There have been court cases which have won against such rulings. And it's just a matter of time before somebody files court cases against this and gets it done. So that trend should definitely be stopped. In a way, it's a non-binding constraint. Most sectors actually don't have 80%. Most sectors have 80% locals anyways. Right? So what the politicians are doing is kind of signaling to the electorate saying that we care for you, the locals. And it's not hurting industry in any case because many sectors don't have so many migrants. But in certain sectors like IT and so on, you'd be foolish to actually implement this. That is why these laws have not yet, I think they focus mostly on the manufacturing sector and not so much on IT and so on. But in principle, no. I mean, in principle, you should not have any restrictions on migration.
Since we wanted to wrap up by 5:30, can the next question be the last one?
Yeah, sure.
Mansi, IDHS shows that overall education levels for migrants is rising between the two rounds. Would you know how this compares to overall gains in education for the population in general? Basically, do we see the educational requirements for migration increase over the years or fall in India and the world?
Yeah, it's a very tough question in the sense I don't have the data to answer this question. So I'll just give you, my thoughts on it. Do we see education requirements for migration go up? Not in the sense that, if the question is, do you need to have a certain level of education before you start moving? As I said, it is the case that most people who move for longer durations are relatively much more educated. They have more years of schooling, college, and so on than others. So in that sense, there's that so-called positive selection already happening on long duration migration strategy. Is that threshold level of education increasing? My sense is no. I think we're seeing a general rise in education levels, and that's being reflected in the migration cohorts as well. I think the first part, is, I mean, I'd be curious to know if this is happening. That exactly, right? Would you know how this compares to overall gains in education for the general population? My guess is it would be similar, but this is something you can easily test out with the IHTS data. Just look at migration and look at the general. So I think the IHTS data itself should tell you that. But note, the migration in India has these two components. What you see in the IHTS data is usually the long duration migrants who are anyway positively selected. But there is this whole class of short-term seasonal migration, which is notoriously difficult to pick up in large sample surveys. And that is completely the inverse. There, it's the least educated who are migrating. So one has to be careful when you use any survey like the NSS or the IHTS to know these different streams of migration and what's happening there. I'll just quickly go over some of these questions. There's one on Digital India, help the gap. Will it bridge the gap between jobs and unemployment in urban areas? Now there's huge uncertainty over COVID-19 and how much of our world is going to be digital, and definitely it's going to last some months, maybe a year or two. But eventually the course of history is, believe it or not, towards face-to-face interaction, which means in-person interaction. Right? So sooner or later, we will go back to living with the power of agglomeration. We will go to restaurants and stuff like that. And it's my reading of history is such that there have been cases where pandemics have gone for many years. I was reading a particular case of a family struck in Tripoli in Libya, which in roughly the late 18th century, and they didn't move out of the house for nearly 1.5 years, and then eventually life got back to normal. This was because of the plague. So there have been cases in history where people think the world is falling, everything will change. But in this particular case, I do think, of course, we'll become more digital, but the value of in-person interaction is always very, very high. It might seem counterintuitive right now because everything we are interacting now, over internet. But this is the law of cities. I would say the law of density, the law of agglomeration. Simple point. If the IT sector, I mean, just think about it. The IT sector is a sector which uses digital and so on. You would think that in the last 30 years of the IT sector, you should have seen IT sectors happen everywhere in the world. It was supposed to kill distance, kill location, if you can work from anywhere. No, we got Bangalore, we got Silicon Valley, we got a particular cluster in Israel, we got a high-tech city in Hyderabad. Clusters matter. Clusters matter because skills there's a knowledge of skills that gets developed, a particular input sharing which happens and output sharing which happens. So if you do a course on urban economics, actually, this is the classic thing. But if you read up stuff of Ed Glaser's Triumph of a City is a great book, by the way. If you want to understand how cities respond to crises and so on. So my sense is that obviously all of us are going to be digitalized, but that doesn't mean our life in 5 years' time is going to be necessarily very, very digital. That is, we will still value in-person interactions. Okay, so a lot of questions on environment. which, as I said, I think great questions. I don't really have, honestly, clear answers. Increasing demand for organic produce with India being a key producer. Yeah, so this question on, agriculture, this reverse migration can boost a lot of sectors. My general sense is no, right? So in the sense that, yes, you can have organic stuff, but you simply don't need so many people in rural India. It's as simple as that. It was true before the reverse migration, and it's even more true now. So yes, in the short term, because people are desperate, you might, but you can see the stories that are coming. Nobody who's working in Surat in the textile shop wants to do back-breaking Mandrega work, right? And getting paid a pittance. The class profile is very different. So when we say Mandrega is a shock absorber, it's a shock absorber for a particular class of workers. But most of the guys who went back would never think of working in Mandrega. Right? So it's a very different kind of skill sets that these people have. So there might be more skill learning which happens across. People who worked in restaurants in Hyderabad, I was reading a story, gone back and started a biryani center in, I think, Bihar or UP. So that sort of a thing, right? You worked in a particular place and got those skills back. But will a particular sector like just organic, kickstart a lot of employment? Maybe there might be few success stories, but as a whole, the numbers we're talking with is not even in millions; it's in tens of millions. That kind of job production can happen only in cities. That is my personal opinion. Ultimately, as I write in my book, it's a choice between a Gandhian view and an Ambedkarite view. Gandhi had this thing about village republics, and Ambedkar, about cities. And so, in the book, I argue for a more Ambedkarite view. But there is, as some have pointed out, an environmental case to make for de-urbanizing and so on. So this is I'm just leaving it out there as different strands of thought, and of course you should feel free to think about however you want. You should come back 5 years later and tell me I've done a study and you're wrong. I'll be more than happy to read it.
Then there aren't any more questions. Can we end it here? And can we encourage all our viewers today and to mail you if they have any more questions?
Yeah, sure. Only thing is I'm going to respond after August 10th because I'm very busy this particular week. But yeah, if you want to write to me, you can, as I said, if you're doing a master's or something later on, and if you're really curious about history, feel free to apply for the internship. The details on my website, or you just search IIM History Internship. And it's great. I've always felt when I studied economics in India, in Bombay, that it was really sad that I did not get any training or exposure to history. I've completely self-taught myself in history. So what I teach here at IIM is urban economics and history, economic history. And Delhi was a vibrant center for economic history in the 60s and 70s, but unfortunately that's kind of gone back. So even if you don't have a full exposure, you should be interested and read some of the basic stuff that's been written in this field. So great, I enjoyed a lot, and thanks for the lovely questions. A lot of them which I'm as clueless as you are, but hopefully some of them might have given some food for thought. Yeah.
Thank you for your time today, Professor, and thank you to all the attendees who came today. We will be uploading the talk soon on our YouTube channel, which we will be sending the link out for soon. And we will be including all the resources that the professor has mentioned as well in the description for that video. Thank you all for coming today, and we hope to see you at our future talks. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. Yeah, I've just given that link where you can check. Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot.